Good morning, everyone. It's the month of Adar. Woo! The Jewish Hebrew month of joy, of ridiculousness. I'm wearing my Adar earrings. See those? um, and I'm so delighted to be together to explore how we cultivate joy at a time that's very challenging for joy uplift and cultivation. So we're going to start with the wonderful Adar song, Mishenichnas Adar Marbim Besimcha. When Adar begins, one increases joy. Shemi, 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 shenichnas Adar. Shemi, 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 shenichnas Adar. Mishenichnas Adar, marbim, marbim besimcha. Mishenichnas Adar, marbim, marbim besimcha. Woo! We'll sing that more later. I love the Misha, 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 Misha. When Adar enters, we increase joy. It's an amazing statement. The new month began just on Friday, this past Friday. And Judaism often has these moments when time says, okay, now feel this. Bring in this quality. And it can be very challenging. I feel cheery already. Yay, thank you, David. Well, that's the idea, but some of us might not. What difficult and challenging times we are in. And I want to explore together how our tradition calls on us and invites us to bring in joy, to do it as a cultivation practice, very consciously and deliberately, engaging in practices of drawing joy close and lifting it. So looking at the Talmud, the section called Taanit, 29a, that first talks about drawing on the Mishnah, an earlier rabbinic text, and the month of Av, which in many ways is the polar opposite of Adar. Av is in the heat of the summer, and Tisha B'Av, the 9th of the month of Av, is the day of deepest collective Jewish sadness. It is on the 9th of Av that we mark the destruction of the first temple and the second temple. So we're marking the destruction of sacred Jewish center, the destruction and dispersion of the Jewish people from homeland, horrific deaths. And the 9th of Av has come to be associated with many other tragedies among the Jewish people. So the Mishnah says, when Av begins, one decreases joy. Mam'itin besimcha, me'at, for little. And the Talmud picks up this teaching and says, Rav Yehuda, son of Rav Shmuel bar Shelat, said, in the name of Rav, just as Keshem she, just as when Av begins, one decreases rejoicing, so too when Adar begins, one increases rejoicing. So the Talmud comes to take the example that's already established in Jewish practice of a day when we limit and reduce and decrease our rejoicing, and says that there's a parallel here, that an experience of national loss is an occasion for embodying it in ourselves and acting in order to experience that directly in our own bodies and hearts. So, too, when the month of Av begins, a month in which we celebrate Purim, a month of national Jewish salvation, um, we do the exact flip. We increase joy. The Talmud goes on to explain what is meant by decreasing joy. How do we do that? Do we listen to sad songs on the radio? Do we cut onions to make ourselves cry? No. The sages taught all mitzvot practiced by a mourner are likewise practiced on the 9th of Av. It's very interesting. So you take, in order to connect with an experience shared by the entire Jewish people, something that might be quite abstract. I don't know what it feels like to lose the temple. That's quite removed from my immediate experience. But I do know personal mourning. I do know individual loss and grief. So the same actions that we do when we are individually in mourning are likewise practiced on the 9th of Av. It's prohibited to engage in eating and in drinking. This is a day of fasting. When you're individually mourning, you don't fast, but you refrain from eating and drinking delicious things, alcohol, from sort of celebrating through food and drink. And in smearing oil on one's body, so a kind of beautification, fragrance, anointing, and in wearing shoes, and in conjugal relations. So shoes as a connection with wealth and um, uh, being dressed up, and in sexual intimacy, the pleasure of it, the deep connection with another person, all of those we refrain from. And it is prohibited to read from the Torah, from the prophets, and from the writings, or to study from the Mishnah, from the Gemara, which is another word for Talmud, and from Midrash, and from the collections of halachot, Jewish law, and collections of agadot, Jewish narratives. So, in addition to all these embodied and physical self restraints, we're also limited in the pleasure of Jewish learning in this period of mourning. So, we want to ask, what is the inverse? What is it that we increase or connect with in Adar in order to increase rejoicing? So it says in Megillot Esther, in the scroll of Esther, toward the end of the narrative, after Haman's plot to destroy the Jewish people throughout the entire kingdom is thwarted. And it says, to observe the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day every year, the days on which the Jews obtained rest from their enemies, and the month which was for them turned from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday. They were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, and as an occasion for sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. What is so noteworthy, I think, is that it's not simply a day of celebration, like Sukkot, for example, which is called Zman Simchatenu, harvest and delighting and joy. This joy, the joy of Adar, the joy of Purim, is one that came very close to disaster, that confronted profound fear, and it turned. It flipped upside down. The relief and the lift of that kind of joy is very distinct. And in that transformation, it becomes a day of feasting and merrymaking, and an occasion to send gifts to one another. Turn, 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 as Sharon wrote. That's right. So during Av, do we not schedule weddings or other celebrations? And do we schedule them during Adar? Great question, Mindy. Thank you. We refrain from having, some people observe 3 weeks leading up to Adar, no music, not cutting hair, not having celebrations, no weddings. Some don't swim, which is such a bummer during the summer. And it's really a time of grieving and mourning. And Adar is such an opportunity for celebration and lift. If there's a funeral during Adar, of course, we mourn and we bury the person, but there are certain parts of the funeral service that we don't say, and a traditional eulogy isn't given. It's quite a tense clash of celebration and a personal moment of mourning. So in this elevation of joy, it also says in the book of Esther, which we include in Havdalah every week, La Yehudim haita ora v'simcha v'sason v'ikar. For the Jews, there was light, joy, gladness, and honor. I want to look at one more piece as we understand what those words might mean. For the Jews, there was light. So this particular commentator, Yosef ibn Yahya, is commenting. He's from the early 16th century, commenting on that verse. What does that mean? There was light and joy and gladness and honor. So he separates the sections of the verse. For the Jews, there was light. Instead of, on account of their suffering, their eyes were darkened from seeing. So instead of the darkness of what they were facing and experiencing, their eyes drew in and saw light where they only saw darkness before. And joy, this is the expanding of spirits outward instead of their worry over their suffering, which is the gathering of spirits inward. So their joy, instead of contracting in worry, their spirits expanded. Great sense of vastness, expansion of heart and soul. And gladness, this is the joy of divine cleaving by means of the holy city, as it says, rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad for her, all you who love her. You know, the Sisu et Yerushalayim Giluva. Those are these words from the book of Isaiah. Instead of their mourning over their loss with God and the inhabitants of God's holy land. So instead of this being a moment of loss, it becomes one of gladness and uplift by deeply connecting to God and Jerusalem, even though the story of Esther takes place in exile, that the temple and Jerusalem represent or embody intimate divine presence. So they are capable of connecting with that sense of God's closeness to them through Jerusalem. And honor, this is the joy of the physical goodness from wealth and honor in place of their mourning for the disgrace and wrath that they were sold like a bull to the slaughter. What strong language. Instead of the feeling that they were abandoned, the anger and disgrace, they actually get to experience. Honor is the sense of physical well-being and delight, eating and drinking and feasting. So I want to take these images and think about them in the context of our own moment. I want to invite you to close your eyes if that feels comfortable, to sit tall, or your gaze can be soft. This experience of touching into the fear of this moment and finding a way to turn it is the invitation of Adar's rejoicing. Not joy that circumvents fear or worry, but that leans right in towards it and laughs at it, gives it the finger, flip the bird at fear, hang a moon. Yes, I said that, hang a moon. It takes a certain audacity to shake our fears like that. I invite you to notice at this time of COVID, on the morning of a heavy snow, at a time when we're isolated, what is a worry or fear that is true for you at this time? Can you feel it in your body? Notice its texture, where in the body that fear or worry sits. If it's difficult to stay present with it, that's okay. Maybe you touch it with your awareness, just gently. Now, can you imagine being bigger than that fear, that worry? What could you do to scare it, to shake it up? Feel free to bring it into your body. Maybe it's a shaking. Maybe it's sound. Ah, ooh, ah, ah. Ah. Maybe it's an expansion. Maybe it's breathing it out. Ah, tapping. Shaking. Ooh. If there's something that you see on the screen that somebody else is doing, feel free to take it on. Maybe it's tender, just a hand to the heart. Maybe it's a little tickling. Maybe just a little smile at the corners of your mouth. How can you shake it, destabilize it? What might you need to imagine it as in order to shake it up? Can we do a little sound? Can we try to scare it? Oh, try. I know it feels ridiculous. That's part of the point. Wubba wubba. Oh, Purim. Oh, that was a good one, Julie. Scare your fears. Pop out of nowhere. You do not have control over me, over us. This is a very deep practice, my friends. Purim is not a children's holiday. We walk around with so much fear. And Purim invites us into the absurdity of turning our deepest fears on their heads, of flipping our consciousness, of shaking our categories, of masking. We've spent so much time masking, but now we're invited to mask and unmask, to reveal what is within in exaggerated and grotesque and ridiculous ways, to embody what we are not as well. Dress up as your polar opposite and see what it feels like to wear that. Take one of your fears and exaggerate it and make it absurd. Let's see what we can free up. Purim is essential as we also look toward Pesach, 30 days after Purim. If we are to be walking toward Pesach's freedom, we need to practice Purim in a way that shakes loose everything that is constricted. Let's sing again. And I invite you to jump up and down, to sing to Misha, Misha, Misha in any ways you can. Misha, 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 נכנס אדר. Misha, 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 נכנס אדר. Misha, נכנס אדר. מרבים, מרבים בשמחה. Misha, נכנס אדר. מרבים, מרבים בשמחה. Misha, 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 נכנס אדר. Misha, 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 נכנס אדר. Misha, נכנס אדר. מרבים, מרבים בשמחה. Misha, נכנס אדר. מרבים, מרבים בשמחה. Misha, 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 נכנס אדר. Misha, 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 נכנס אדר. Misha, נכנס אדר. מרבים, מרבים בשמחה. משנכנס אדר מרבים מרבים בשמחה. משנכנס אדר. נכנס אדר. משנכנס אדר מרבים מרבים בשמחה. משנכנס אדר מרבים מרבים בשמחה. Hello, Adar faces. I think it's also worth noting that this can be a very challenging practice. Many days, just in the last few days, lately, I have not been feeling so joyous. So I want to encourage you to think trickily and creatively. How can you trick heavy-heartedness? How can you fool your mind instead of going to the things that are difficult or that stir worry? How can you get yourself laughing at yourself? Make a pact with a friend to exchange jokes every day this month. When you notice yourself starting to sink, how can you get up and do a funny movement and or a 2-minute dance party? These are the practices of this month. As much mitzvah, as much commandment and our soul obligations as any other mitzvah. So may we turn sorrow into gladness, worry into expansion, fear and constriction into strength and joy. Ken yehi ratzon. May it free up our energy. Amen, amen, amen. Look to traditional Jewish humor as an extension of Torah. Absolutely. I want to share a prayer for healing. Let's gather in all our dear ones who may be struggling with health of body or health of spirit. New Yorker cartoons, that too, yes, indeed. May we gather them in, all who are ill, and hold them in our hearts and pray for them. Ana elna, ana elna, ana elna, refana lana elna, ana elna, ana elna, refana lana elna, ana elna, ana elna, refana